Okay, moving swiftly on from digital mental health to chemical mental health, and introducing Sally Marlow. We first saw Sally Marlow talk at an event called Pint of Science, and we really liked the way she spoke, and also the content of her talk, which was on alcohol and ketamine, I remember. So Dr. Sally Marlow is a public engagement fellow in the addictions department at King's College, if you haven't guessed from this enormous placard, where she's responsible for initiating...
Just stating my territory. You know where I am, just remind you where I'm from.
There we go.
Sorry.
No. Trying to introduce you.
Yeah, I know. Bad impulse control.
Yes, where she's responsible for initiating, developing and delivering public engagement and media initiatives to support the strategic direction of the Addictions Department and the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience. So, very warm welcome to Sally. I'm excited for this.
Thanks everyone. And what you're supposed to do when you do one of these things is you try to find your link to the previous talk. So my link to the previous talk is I have had transcranial magnetic stimulation. And I had it when I was making a documentary for Radio 4 about anorexia nervosa. And as part of that, because it makes a great sound, that magnet, it's like a woodpecker. So as part of that, we went and we interviewed somebody who's doing research for anorexia nervosa, particularly with people who have severe and enduring anorexia. And I had this stuff done, 2 5-second bursts. All I can tell you, my limited sample size of all, is I went home that night and I ate like a horse. Now I know that that's not, I eat like a horse most nights, so that's not necessarily anything to do with the science, but there you go. So that's my link to the previous talk. What I am going to tell you a little bit about is why I do this stuff, why I do public engagement stuff, why I do events like this, why I think it's important. My research area is alcohol, and it's women whose children are removed from them by the family courts because the women have a drug problem or more often an alcohol problem. So that's what I do alongside the public engagement work. That in itself is something I feel really passionate about, and passionate about dispelling some of the myths about. But it sits within this field of addiction, mental health, where there's so much which is misunderstood, and there is so much that people jump to conclusions about. People have biases, people ignore the evidence, ignore the science, and make judgments that they think are somehow moral and are somehow more valid for those reasons. So for me, it's really important to get information out about drugs, about addiction, about mood-altering substances, what they do, why they do it, how they do it. And so when I was talking to Joe about what would be a good topic for today, we thought that it would be good to do alternative approaches to recreational drugs, basically because that let me talk about absolutely anything that I want to talk about. So what I want to do in the next short while is I want to share with you some of my fascination with addiction, drugs, mind-altering, mood-altering, human beings, why we do it, why it's important to us, why we continue to persist in doing it even though we know it's doing us harm, and what it is that by asking questions, and I'm not going to give you any answers because I don't know any answers, but by asking questions, just maybe make you think a little bit differently about some of the things that you know or that you think you know. And so I figured that the best way to do this was actually to give you almost like some case studies. So the first thing I wanted to do, some shots of different drugs, that's a joke, you all missed it, never mind, I'm going to give you some drug shots. That was drug shots, yes. So the first thing I'm going to do is put it into some kind of context, and I'm going to talk about laudanum, which some of you might have heard of, most of you might have heard of. So I'm going to talk about the history. Drugs have always been with us, and I've just picked one at random, and that's laudanum, because it's a mixture of what is now a legal and an illegal drug, opium and alcohol. Then I'm going to hopefully tell you something new about 3 different drugs. One, heroin, another, psychedelics as a class of drugs, so I'm going to tell you something about those, and also nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide, because it's a funny one, that it's so ubiquitous. I can't believe there's anyone in this room who hasn't come across it. It's kind of legal, but you know, there are moves to make it not legal, and so it's kind of an interesting thing. And what I want to do is make you think of it, and I could give you some sort of polemic about what I think about these drugs, and what I think about drug policy, and what I think about drug treatment, and how we should be doing it differently, and how we should be using different approaches. But I think actually it might be, I'm aware that I've got the graveyard slot today, I've got the last slot of the afternoon, that you're all quite tired probably, and if you've been watching the equivalent of BBC Two's Horizon with cutting edge science, I'm going to give you a bit of the One Show now, so that you can just kind of roll back a bit from that. And why is it important to think about any topic differently? And as I say that, I realise that sounds really patronising, so I'll take it back. But why I think it's really important in anything to do with mental health, neuroscience, psychology, psychiatry, is because the brain, we're all in this room together because the brain is fascinating, and we all find the brain fascinating. We're all in this room together because the brain is complicated, and we want to understand the workings of the brain, both the workings of the brain itself and the workings of the brain within the context of what it is to be a human being. So how do we do that? We do it through research. And as we research, we focus, we do it seriously, we do it systematically. We have research questions, we employ rigor to try and get to those research questions. Whether we are hard scientists looking at molecules or whether we are social scientists looking at social systems. What that can sometimes lead to is a narrow focus. And as researchers, we can sometimes get too narrow in terms of what we think about. This is why I think I'm incredibly privileged to have a public engagement focus in my work as well as my research focus, because that gives me permission to think more widely. Research requires depth, but actually you need breadth as well. And I've included this last picture here. Does anybody know the story of the paradigm of inventing the bicycle saddle? Has anyone heard that story before? So, when the bicycle was invented, the word saddle was used for the thing that you sit on. And of course, a saddle was designed for a horse. So a saddle was designed for something initially. A saddle was designed for something with a very broad back. That's not what a bicycle saddle looks like. A bicycle saddle looks like this. But for years, they could not get the bicycle saddle right because they were locked in that paradigm of it being a saddle and taking that idea without being able to open up to new ideas. So the title, I know I'm being a bit facetious when I say alternative approaches, that gives me room to talk about whatever I like. I think actually alternative approaches is really important when you're thinking about drugs, because that's how we learn more, and alternative approaches are really important alongside the rigorous systematic research when we're thinking about all aspects of mental health, of the brain, of human beings. So I'm going to talk about alternative approaches, but these are not new approaches, because actually there is nothing new under the sun. When it comes to the brain, when it comes to human behaviours, the only new things are things that we learn, and that's by taking new ways of thinking about things, new ways of thinking about technology to help us uncover new discoveries. But actually, there is nothing new in human behaviour under the sun. If there was, we wouldn't still go and watch Greek tragedies at the National Theatre. We wouldn't still read Shakespeare. There is nothing new about human behaviour. And in terms of drug taking, since those very first fruits fell off trees and started to ferment, and along came whichever version of Homo erectus sapiens, or whichever one it was, and picked those up and discovered that actually if you ate those fermenting fruits, which were turning to alcohol, you felt great. There has been an understanding that you can take things which alter mood, which alter mind, which make you feel better. I think it's really interesting that we have cannabinoid receptors in our brains. So if you think about that from an evolutionary perspective, you've got man developing, and I'm using man in a sort of a species sense, not in a non-feminist sense. You've got man kind of developing, you've got the plant, cannabis, developing, and there happens to be in the brain of man this thing which just ideally fits this molecule which can cross the blood-brain barrier and sit on it and make man feel better. So I think there's something, gone off at a tangent there, but there's something about, even if you trace back, you know, so many years we can't even think about what life must have been like. People have always been looking for drugs, for something to alter human experience. Now then there's the question of why. Well, that's a different lecture. You know, some would say you're born, you live, you die. Why wouldn't you want to alter human experience? Some would say it's about other things, but some would say that, and we do know that some people are more vulnerable to want to change their reality than others are, for a whole host of different ways. So laudanum then, have you guys come across laudanum? Anybody know what it is? Okay, so laudanum, I chose this one because laudanum was a mixture of opioids and alcohol, so grains of morphine, which, oh happy accident, dissolve well in alcohol, much better than they do in water. So in a bottle, you would go to the pharmacist and you would buy laudanum. You would buy it, it was used medicinally, it was discovered really in the 17th century properly, slightly before that, but it was used for pain relief, as a cough suppressant and for diarrhea, and it was mainly prescribed to women and children. So if anybody has come across Kubla Khan, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the Romantics, we know, were very keen on opium, and they were very keen on laudanum, because that was one of the ways you could get your opium, your morphine, from the chemist, basically. It was like going to buy Nurofen Plus, which incidentally does have a form of an opiate in it. It has codeine, which is a very close cousin, so we haven't actually moved on that much. It was prescribed mainly to women and children, but people, as well as taking it for medicinal reasons, and this is the first thing about drugs, which is, it had wherever thus, the link between something medicinal and something which is mood-altering, pleasure-giving, mind-altering, sometimes the boundaries are very, very blurred between substances. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that with some of the other things we come on to. So Samuel Taylor Coleridge was a great proponent of laudanum. This is Lizzie Siddal, who was the wife of Rossetti. And this is a very famous painting which some of you may recognise, which is Ophelia in the Lake. Lizzie Siddal became addicted to laudanum. Well, laudanum is made up of two of the most addictive substances known to man or woman, alcohol and opium, so it's not a great surprise that she did become addicted. But all the men around her were taking laudanum as well, and they didn't become addicted. She died from laudanum-related complications. So why did it affect Lizzie Siddal and it didn't affect the men around her? Well, she was a poet in her own right. She was an artist in her own right, and yet she became their muse. She became the object of their art rather than creating it herself. She was a working class girl who worked in a hat shop, and she was discovered, if you like, by these bohemian men with private incomes who passed her from one to the other. Even though she was married to Rossetti, she had affairs with others as well. And we see this pattern repeated in terms of why women become addicted, abusive relationships with men, insecurity, self-esteem, not being able to fulfill potential, etc., etc. It was available in chemists without prescription, and it was cheap, so it was a working class drug. Now, you can still get laudanum on prescription, and it is not prescribed very often. When it is, it's sometimes for pain, but very, very rarely for pain. It's prescribed for neonatal abstinence syndrome. What's that? That's babies who are born with some sort of addiction to an opiate because of their mother's opiate use. So laudanum is used to wean the babies off, to detox the babies effectively. It's also used for treatment-resistant diarrhea because it's one of the few things which will actually stay down when somebody has got very, very severe diarrhea. So particularly with people who've got diarrhea related to in advanced stages of AIDS, and that type of very severe, absolutely no other treatment, no way of stopping the diarrhea, which is going to be an ongoing thing. So it's still around. So we have this drug with its medicinal uses, which also came out of the chemist and became a recreational thing. But from a recreational thing, also could be dangerous in terms of somebody who was already vulnerable, Lizzie Sidal. But bring that drug right back to right now, and we're still using it medicinally. We're still using it, and arguably that combination of alcohol and opiates, people are using all day, every day. They're just making their own combination. So that's the first case history I wanted to show you. But then I wanted also to talk to you about the headline-grabbing drug, heroin. So I wanted to talk to you about heroin within the context of the Vietnam War, because I wanted to show you something else about drugs which I think is important, and that's the role of context. So heroin, bells sound, lights flash, alarm, alarm, drug of untold evil, moral panic about heroin, and it is a very, very dangerous drug. People who get addicted to heroin have so much worse outcomes, from everything from mortality to owning their own home, to holding down a job, to having relationships. It can destroy lives, heroin. There is absolutely no doubt about it. So why the Vietnam War? Well, during the Vietnam War, if you think about what war situations would be like, and there are enough movies around about the Vietnam War, good ones and bad ones, that kind of give us a sense of this. What is war about? It's about extreme trauma. We know high rates of mental health, PTSD, depression, anxiety, fear, out and out fear, bereavement, loss, grief. I mean, it's all there in war. And then what you're doing with your own actions, albeit because that's what you're ordered to do, but your own actions and having to take responsibility for those actions. The Vietnam War, as I'm sure you guys have some sense of, was really a pretty futile war and went on and on and on with much needless loss of life on all sides, for a whole host of reasons. And in Vietnam, a lot of the soldiers, and they were mainly men, started to self-medicate against the horrors of war with heroin. Why heroin? It was quick, it's easily available. When you inject something, it goes straight into your bloodstream, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, not like alcohol where you have to drink it and then it has to be digested, and it's got metabolic processes and it takes longer. It was there, it was available, it was normalised because there was a momentum in terms of the number of people who were taking heroin. I'm talking now about the American soldiers who were there in Vietnam. And why wouldn't you, when you were surrounded by those horrors, why wouldn't you be looking for something to take you away from those horrors? And if it was there, why wouldn't you do it? But there was a moral panic at home. I mean, there was all sorts of panic about the Vietnam War, quite rightly, but there was a moral panic at home back in America because these soldiers, when the war ended, were going to come home. And what were they going to do with all of those heroin addicts? America was going to have to absorb and find treatment for these men who fought for their country, but they were coming home heroin addicts. What were they going to do? What's really interesting is there was a woman called Lee Robbins who did a study of all the men coming home in 1 month, September 1971. So on this side of the slide, we've got what they reported their use was before they came home, but they were coming home imminently. 43% of men about to return home reported narcotic use. So the main narcotic being heroin or some form of opium. So my slide previously, when I was saying lots of them took heroin or opiates, well, they did, 43% of them. 46% of that 43, so nearly half, reported they were addicted. They felt that they had addiction, with all the things which go along with addiction: craving, lack of control, needing more and more of the drug to get their own to get the same effect. 23% had a positive urine sample at the time of return home of the 43%. So that means 23% of them had heroin as in their system, were actually actively using it, right then on that day. And heroin in urine samples, different opiates turn into metabolites, but very quickly are excreted. So if you're doing a urine test, it's a pretty good indicator of kind of pretty immediate use if you find one of those metabolites in urine. So then these guys came home, and what happened? Well, after they'd been home for a few months, only 10% reported any narcotic use at all. And only 7% of that 10%, so we're down to very small numbers now, reported that they were addicted, as opposed to 46% of 43%, so that's around about 22% of the total. We're now down to around about 1% reporting heroin addiction. 7% of those who were tested had, of the 10% had a positive urine sample, which could have come about because they were taking opiate-based painkillers, because they produce the same metabolites, some of the same metabolites. So, hang on a minute. This is heroin, isn't it? We're talking about heroin here. This is heroin, the most addictive drug on the planet. The drug, how is this possible? Did they all go into treatment? No. Did they have any? No. What changed? Well, their context changed. Heroin was not available, and they were no longer surrounded by the horrors of war. Lots of them had good support from families, even if the mental health problems that they had in Vietnam still came home with them. They were now in a different place. The drug taking was there in that context. They were now here in this context. So what does that mean in terms of what we think about addiction? To me, what that means is we have to really challenge this idea that addiction is purely a disorder of the brain, that addiction is purely about what happens at a neuroreceptor, at a molecular level. Not that I'm discounting that there are very real changes in neuronal pathways, in downregulation and upregulation of neuroreceptors. I'm not discounting that at all. Absolutely, that is part and parcel of it. But so is social context. So is your environment, and a really, really important part. What does that mean then for the idea that addiction is a disease, a brain disease? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that we need to ask the question. And I also wanted to show you this one, which is about heroin. So this is Rat Park. This was an experiment which really, I think, should have started a whole new wave of research in addiction around heroin. So Bruce Alexander set up 2 communities of rats. One community of rats in an impoverished community, a bare concrete box, and one community of rats in a, it's a bad photo, for which I apologise, as it's expanded, it's really lost its definition. Lots of things for them to play on, little trees painted around the edges, lots of nice straw for them to cuddle up in. So an enriched environment. Two communities of rats. Both communities had 2 feeding bottles. One feeding bottle had glucose in it, a glucose liquid mix in it. The other one had a heroin and cocaine mix in it. And guess what? The rats in the impoverished environment didn't touch the food, the glucose, but did drain the bottles of the heroin and cocaine mixture. The rats in the enriched environment didn't give a damn about the heroin and the cocaine. All they wanted was the glucose to keep them alive, the food. So again, rats are rats. They're not human beings, and I'm not for one moment saying that they are. But there is something important about the role of context. Even when you strip out all of that, what it is to be human, when you strip it down to the primitive animal bit of the brain, in this case the brain of the rat, there is something about context, comfort, feeling life has purpose and meaning, even at the level of rats, which affects whether you take drugs or not. What am I doing for time? I'm way over. Right, I'm going to speed it up. So the next drug I wanted to tell you something new about was psychedelics, and actually Joe and I, this is where we started from when we had a conversation about what I would talk about. So this is the only slide where I'm actually sticking to the script, Joe. I hope that's all right. Psychedelics. LSD was used as treatment for people with severe, what was referred to as alcoholism, alcohol dependence, we'd probably call it now, and also for people who had severe anxiety about end of life. So people with terminal illnesses who were really very distressed that they were dying in the 1950s. And it was legal, as was psilocybin, which is also a hallucinogenic, a psychedelic drug. And there was lots of research and search for medical applications for these drugs because, they held out so much promise. And then the counterculture got hold of it and started dropping acid and taking magic mushrooms and writing songs about it. And that was very frightening for legislators and politicians. And so in the 1970s, psychedelic drugs, the majority of psychedelic drugs were made illegal, and the research into them dried up, the medical research. So we're back here again, if we think about it, to these links with the laudanum, the recreational use of stuff, which is also used in some kind of medical therapeutic sense. And what happened in the case of psychedelics is research completely dried up. But then, now, there's research which is starting to look at psychedelic drugs as a possible treatment for severe depression. And back to this here, back to people end-of-life care who are extremely depressed about the fact that their lives are ending, extremely distressed about the fact that their lives are ending. And the latest study on this was in Lancet Psychiatry and came out of Imperial College. David Nutt was the end author on this one. It's the one that I've referenced here. What I think is a side story about why we're now looking at psychedelic drugs again is the why suddenly did people start researching this and thinking, well, what are the medicinal uses of this? Let's open that drawer again and dust it off and have a look at it again. Good old-fashioned observation. Somebody in the States was looking at a massive data set on depression and noticed that people who reported that they'd used LSD when they were younger actually did better. And said, hang on a minute, is there something in that? And that's where the first trials came from. Good old-fashioned observational data. When you're looking for one thing and something else jumps out of a data set at you. And the side story is that's how we have Viagra. Because Viagra was a drug which was being used for blood pressure and angina. And what people observed when their patients, a lot of whom were men, were coming back into the clinics, is the patients were telling them, and do you know what, doctor, that erectile dysfunction I had seems to clear up when I take my pill. And that's why we have Viagra. good old-fashioned observation. So it's back to this thing about alternative approaches. Don't stay narrow because that is good for your research, but don't be closed, because there's other stuff floating around in the periphery which might be really important, Viagra or not. Nitrous oxide is the last one I'm going to talk about, and we have got a moral panic here. Lambeth has just banned hippie crack, as it's referred to by the Daily Mail. The reality is, and this is the last year I could find the death rates for, 2011, one death in 2011. Of course, that one death was splattered all over the papers because it was probably some middle-class child and he went to a public school, and we all get very exercised about that. Fewer than heroin and morphine. I mean, look at the difference. One death compared to 2,652. Fewer than cocaine, 112. Fewer than ecstasy, 13. Even ecstasy is not very big. And fewer than cannabis, 7. Of course, what's not in here is alcohol, which would eclipse all of them. And alcohol's not in there. But that's another story. When there are deaths, it tends to be because instead of inhaling out of a balloon, what people are doing are using gas masks or doing it out of plastic bags to get best bang for your buck. If you've got gas, you want to preserve it and make sure you can breathe in as much as you can. But that can result in asphyxiation. So that when there is a death, it's not the nitrous oxide, it's the asphyxiation, which is caused by the way that you're taking the drug. And the drug, David Nutt again, not that I'm particularly posted on to David Nutt, but I do think he talks a lot of sense as well as this is being streamed, isn't it? So I would say I do think he talks a lot of sense. So he does make me talk a hell of a lot of sense. The drug has been described by David Nutt as remarkably safe, considering its ubiquity, and it is ubiquitous. Any festival that you go to, I mean, you're tripping over them. Brick Lane, I went to Brick Lane with my husband, who's a cyclist, middle-aged man in Lycra. And there's an awful lot of people using bicycles around here, because it's the same silver canisters that you carry to blow your tyre up, except they've got another gas in, I don't know what. And I'm like, no, darling, that's not what it is. I hope he's not watching this, it's live streaming. Okay. But nitrous oxide has a long history. So Sir Humphrey Davy, who invented the miner's lamp, who we think of as this eminent scientist, who was, worked at the Royal Institution, was absolutely one of the most eminent scientists of his day, built himself a leather lung so that he could ingest quart after quart after quart of nitrous oxide. And then he wrote about it. And these papers are important scientific papers held in the archives of the Royal Institution. How does that sit with the moral panic that we have that results in banning what's essentially really quite a safe drug? And the last bit of this really is just to say human ingenuity is such that the thing about humans is they do want to alter mood. If there's the opportunity to do it, they will do it. And new technology is offering ways to do that. And here we are linking, without being facetious, to the previous talk, because technology, the digital world, is opening up whole new ways of accessing drugs and finding out the harms and ways to reduce the harms of those drugs. We used to call it the dark web, and now we have to call it the crypto market, because apparently the dark web glamorises it too much. I don't know, the dark web makes it sound a bit gothic to me, which I find quite glamorous, but I appreciate I'm in a minority there. But the crypto web is opening up whole new markets. And we keep selling nitrous oxide, but you don't go online and go, nitrous oxide to get wasted. You go, nitrous oxide to inject into whipped cream for catering purposes. That's what you buy. And if you look on Amazon and you search nitrous oxide, this is what you'll see. We got cream. Nobody ever uses these things for cream. Of course they don't. And there are thousands of brands to choose from. We're ingenious like that. So that's how we market it. And novel psychoactive substances, which are sold as plant food or dry cleaning chemicals, I mean, a lot of them are plant food and dry cleaning chemicals, and you really do need to know that, but that's another story. So we mark them up, not fit for human consumption. And that's why legislating in the current round of discussions about the Novel Psychoactive Substances Bill, Novel Psychoactive Substances Act, it's a bit of a nonsense, because we'll always find ways round it, because there's something in us that does that. Something in us that just drives that. So what's the point of my talk then? There's not a lot of point, it's all a bit incoherent in terms of how it hangs together, but I just wanted to tell you some of the things that I find absolutely fascinating about drugs, and try and illustrate those with some of the examples. And I think some of these things, hopefully, I'm sure some of you knew some of them already, but some of you hopefully didn't. And maybe it's just shaken up a bit, that there might be other ways of looking, not just at drugs, but other areas of your studies and other things that you're learning. Context is absolutely key. Not everything is about the brain. It is always about the brain in context. And I would say, if something is niggling at you, you've noticed something in your work, look at it. What does it mean? Why is it niggling? It's speaking to you about something. Human beings are creative in how they take drugs and in how they market drugs, and curiosity is a fundamental human characteristic, one of the characteristics that contributes to drug taking in the first place. And this is another talk, which I'm not going to give now, but I do think that history, anthropology, philosophy and art, all of these can inform what we know about mind-altering substances, but also wider than my subject area, what we know about the mind itself. And I just think if we can be a bit more creative about the approaches that we use to think about drugs, and think about them just a bit differently without being hung up on right or wrong, good or bad judgment. And I'm not standing here as someone who wants to legalise all drugs. That's not my platform at all. My platform is just, let's step outside of the existing paradigms and see what we can find out. And I'm done. Thank you very
much. We have time for a few questions. We've done a little break. Yes.
Don't ask me anything technical, because I don't know anything about any of this.
So I was just wondering about gene-environment interactions.
Yeah.
Because you talk about Vietnam and then you talk about the rat study.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking that the context is important, but people who are maybe not genetically at risk of becoming addicted, we know that there is potential for genetics and addiction. Could that be that the context, an example of gene-environment interaction, and that might be one of the things that predicates whether somebody actually goes into addiction, or whether somebody takes drugs and then in a different context doesn't continue with them?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. Longer answer, why? We know that different drugs are addictive to different levels of heritability, but they all cluster around 50%. We know there's no single gene which is necessary or sufficient. There's no addiction gene. We know there's around 100 involved. So if we start with the gene bit of the gene-environment interaction, what we know is there is genetic vulnerability. There are people who are predisposed not only to take drugs, and those genes might be slightly different to ones who then go on to develop an addiction once they are taking drugs. And those genes are basically the ones that sit behind the brain processes and the ones that sit behind some of the metabolic processes. So then what does that mean? Well, like all gene-environment reactions, genetics are not deterministic in the way that we used to think it was nature or nurture. They work together. So what is it within the environment which can then interact? So certain environmental triggers also increase vulnerability. So triggers like socioeconomic status, triggers like domestic violence, triggers like a mental health problem, which arguably could also be genetic because there may be genes underlying and they may be some of the same genes. But there are risk factors across those. The problem with drugs is drugs alter the brain. So my talk hasn't been about that. My talk hasn't been about about changes in function and architecture in the brain when you take drugs, but there are changes when you take drugs. And those changes may make you more vulnerable to addiction as well. What we don't know much about is about the epigenetics, so we don't know much about the mechanisms by which there might be gene and environment interactions. We just don't know, and we're kind of lagging behind certainly physical health and a lot of other mental health in terms of working that out, I think.
And my second point was that basically, unfortunately, bipolar, for example, risk-taking, drug-taking is one of the things that comes with it. And also comorbidity with things like ADHD. So all of these complicate, and obviously drugs, things like crystal meth, can then lead to schizophrenia type symptoms, depression-like symptoms. So it's hard to say whether it's more the underlying cause. It's more likely to be a combination of, say, childhood factors, exacerbation, and all of that. But therapeutically, it's really hard to deal with it when you can't actually tangle out the key cause.
I think that's right, and I think that the reasons why people become addicted to substances, or to even just take substances, forget addiction for a minute, are as varied as human beings themselves, infinitely varied. So. People talk about an addictive personality. Is there such a thing as addictive personality? I would argue that you couldn't sum up anyone's personality in one word, never mind in a side of A4, or in a chapter. So when we talk about addiction, we can't sum up human beings, and we cannot sum up their relationships with drugs that straightforwardly. So there is a thing about what comes first. So the big debate, and I had cannabis in this talk and psychosis, and I took it out actually because I figured I wanted to talk to you guys about something new. Cannabis and psychosis. There's the whole thing about cannabis, particularly stronger forms, skunk, and increasing your risk of psychotic symptoms. But what we don't understand is whether people who are more vulnerable to psychotic symptoms are more likely to use cannabis. Because they're trying to self-medicate before the psychotic symptoms have been there because of some kind of prodromal syndrome, and we don't know that. Or that there's something underlying both, and that both are manifestations of some underlying thing, which we aren't even able to describe as phenotype. We don't know what that is. So I think that the relationship between drugs and mental health is very, very complicated. What I do know, though, is if you are doing drugs and you have a mental health problem, if you stop doing drugs, and particularly alcohol, you almost always will have an improvement in your mental health. And you may need that improvement in your mental health to allow you to address the mental health problem, to enable you to work with that mental health problem.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. And now we're going to have about a few minutes break. And then move swiftly on with Elaine Hunter to finish us for today. Thank you very much again, Sally. Some water or something. You've got a couple of minutes to do that.
Okay, great. I will talk for the day today. It's Dr. Elaine Hunter, and Elaine is a consultant clinical psychologist and the lead for the Depersonalization Disorders Service. And clinically, Dr. Hunter has an interest and expertise in working with dissociation and childhood trauma within psychosis. So she's a visiting lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry and regularly does conferences like that. She's also spent some time teaching CBT to clinicians in Uganda and Zimbabwe, and is the Sierra Leone lead for the Ebola Psychological Support Service. So we're really lucky to have Elaine with us today, and we're really interested in what she has to say to us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I don't know what I'm going to say yet. Good, thank you very much for that introduction. And so today I'm going to be talking about dissociation and depersonalization. So I thought by first of all thinking a little bit about what is dissociation, and that might be something that you think you could answer quite quickly, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than it may seem at the beginning. So when we think about the DSM-5 psychiatric definition of dissociation, which I'm quite happy with in some ways. A disruption in the usual